When I was 13, my parents refused to feed me, saying, "If you can't afford your own food, you don't deserve it." And the sentence still echoed in the kitchen the night I realized they meant it. The refrigerator hummed like a witness. Its light spilled across empty shelves. No milk, no leftovers, not even a forgotten apple. Behind me, my mother's bracelets clinked as she crossed her arms, and my father counted coins at the table like a cashier closing a register. I remember the smell of their dinner. Garlic, butter, something rich enough to make my stomach tighten painfully. At 15, they slid a wrinkled note across the table, rent. Due Friday. My name was written in my father's careful block letters. His pen strokes were steady. Mine weren't. I stared at that paper longer than I'd ever looked at a report card, and for the first time, hunger didn't scare me. Silence did. I learned early that in our house, silence was mistaken for weakness. I was the quiet child, the one teachers praised for neat handwriting and neighbors forgot to greet, and my parents treated that quiet like proof I wouldn't fight back. My father liked loud things, loud opinions, loud footsteps, loud reminders that everything under his roof belonged to him. My mother preferred sharper weapons. Sighs, glances, the way she spoke about me to relatives as if I were a disappointing investment. They used to say I was easy, which meant I asked for little and noticed everything. I noticed how plates were counted before dinner to make sure one wasn't wasted on me. I noticed how my chores multiplied while their praise shrank. I noticed that when guests visited, I became invisible unless they needed tea. What they never noticed was what silence does when it's cornered. It starts listening. It starts learning. By 14, I understood bills, signatures, and the careful tone adults use when they're lying politely. By 15, I understood something more useful. People who underestimate you rarely see you coming. The rent note didn't come alone. It was followed by smaller slips of paper, each folded once, each placed exactly where I would find it. On my pillow beside my toothbrush under my glass of water. Utilities, groceries, late fee. My father never handed them to me directly. He preferred the quiet theater of discovery. I would unfold the paper, feel his eyes on me from across the room, and hear the faint tap of his spoon against his cup, like a metronome measuring my reaction. My mother specialized in softer cuts. When relatives called, she spoke sweetly into the phone, then covered the receiver and murmured, "Stand up straight. At least look useful." If I passed her in the hallway, she'd glance at my hands as if checking whether I'd stolen something. When I washed dishes, she'd rewash one plate slowly, deliberately, without a word. They never raised their voices. That was the craft of it. Their disappointment lived in pauses. The extra second before answering me, the way conversations shifted when I entered, the careful politeness they used as if I were a guest who had overstayed. And all the while they smiled. The moment didn't feel dramatic. No slammed doors, no thunder, no music swelling in the background. It happened on a Tuesday evening while my father was trimming his nails at the table, the soft click of the clippers marking time. He slid another paper toward me without looking up. Final notice, it read. The amount was higher than before. At the bottom, he'd added a late penalty in neat ink, as if he were proud of the math. I studied the number, then his hands, steady, precise, patient. Hands that believed they controlled everything inside those walls. Something settled in me, not anger, not fear. Recognition. They weren't joking. They weren't teaching responsibility. They were testing how far they could go before I broke. I folded the paper once, the way he always did, and placed it back on the table. Neither of them looked surprised. They thought my silence meant surrender, it always had. My mother stirred her tea. My father clipped another nail. That was when I understood the advantage of being underestimated. No one watches you prepare. The next morning at school, I asked to use the counselor's phone. My voice didn't shake when I explained why. And when I hung up, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Control. I didn't rush after that call. Urgency is loud, and loud gets noticed. Instead, I treated the next days like an assignment I intended to ace. I reread the notes they'd given me and kept them flat in a folder between my school worksheets, careful not to crease the ink where the amounts were written. Evidence, I'd learned, is strongest when it looks ordinary. At the library, I chose a computer near the back wall and searched slowly, the way our teachers showed us when verifying sources. Tenant laws. Child welfare standards. Definitions of neglect. I wrote nothing down that could be found later, only memorized phrases, dates, thresholds. Numbers were especially important. Systems, I realized, trusted numbers more than feelings. At home, I behaved exactly the same. I washed dishes. I thanked them for passing the salt. When my father mentioned interest on my debt, I nodded like someone considering a fair offer. Their guard lowered further each day, the way people relax when a storm they expected never arrives. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't waiting for courage. I was waiting for documentation, timing, and the quiet authority of someone who knew the rules better than they did. They came on a gray afternoon when the house was at its most honest. No guests, no music, no performance. Just the ticking wall clock and the faint smell of detergent from the laundry my mother had hung by the window. The knock was soft. My father opened the door with the same polite smile he used on delivery drivers. It stayed there for exactly 2 seconds. Then it loosened, first confusion, then calculation. 2 people stood on the step, calm, professional, holding folders the way doctors hold charts. One of them spoke in a tone so even it sounded rehearsed. I recognized the cadence. I'd practiced it in my head for days. I didn't watch their faces. I watched their hands. My father's fingers curled slightly against the doorframe. My mother's bracelets went still. The questions were simple. Food. Rent. Notes. Dates. I handed over the folder when asked. No speeches. No accusations. Just paper. The house grew quieter with every answer they gave. Not defensive, careful. The kind of careful people use when they realize the rules have shifted and they didn't notice when it happened. I stood behind them, silent as ever. Only now the silence wasn't theirs to control. After they left, the house felt rearranged even though nothing had moved. My father sat at the table with his hands flat against the wood, as if testing whether it still belonged to him. My mother walked from room to room without purpose, straightening objects that were already straight. Neither of them looked at me. For the first time, they didn't know which version of me they were supposed to see, the quiet child or the witness. Phone calls started that evening. Low voices. Careful wording. I caught fragments drifting down the hallway, misunderstanding, temporary stress. They spoke as if language could rewind time. It couldn't. Paper trails don't forget, and systems don't sympathize with excuses that arrive too late. At school, nothing changed, and that was the strangest part. The same bell rang. The same lockers slammed. The world hadn't paused for my life to tilt. I realized then how many kids probably carried invisible battles inside perfectly ordinary backpacks. That was why it mattered. Not revenge. Proof. Proof that quiet people aren't powerless. Proof that patience can be a form of strength. Proof that sometimes survival doesn't look heroic. It looks organized. In the weeks that followed, the house learned a new language. Doors closed more gently. My name was spoken carefully, as if it were something fragile that might crack if handled the old way. No one mentioned rent again. Plates appeared at dinner without being counted. My parents moved around me with a cautious politeness usually reserved for strangers you hope to impress. I didn't mistake it for love. But I did recognize it as distance, and distance, I discovered, can be peaceful. I stopped memorizing their footsteps. I slept through the night without listening for the refrigerator's hum. At school, my shoulders loosened. I answered questions without rehearsing them in my head first. The counselor checked in sometimes, not with pity, just with a steady look that said you did what you had to do. What happens next is simple. I leave when I'm ready. I study, I work, I build a life where kindness isn't rationed and silence isn't mistaken for weakness. I don't need revenge anymore. I already took back the only thing they ever tried to charge me for. My worth.